Good evening, bonsoir. Thank you so much for being with us this evening and for following our International Women's Day agenda. Tonight we have an extraordinary researcher and close friend, Sonya Lipsett-Rivera, who will give a lecture entitled Gender Violence in Latin America, the Legacy of the Past. This presentation by Dr. Lipsett-Rivera explores how the historical and cultural processes of Latin America have determined the presence of violence in the daily reality of the peoples of the region, with a special emphasis on gender violence. Sonya Lipsett-Rivera is a professor of history at Carleton University. She is the author of several books, including Gender and the Negotiation of Daily Life in Mexico, 1750 to 1856, as well as the co-editor of the anthologies The Faces of Honor, Sex, Shame, and Violence in Colonial Latin America, and Emotions and Daily Life in Colonial Mexico. She has written numerous articles, chapters, and encyclopedia articles, and she is a recipient of the Tibesar Prize, as well as the Marston LaFrance Research Fellowship. Her fields of expertise focuses on Latin America, especially Mexico, environmental and social history, gender and family, popular culture and violence, and her research interests refer to origins of gender violence in Latin America, masculinity in colonial Mexico, Latin America, especially Mexico. And as I said, she's a true friend of UNAM Canada. Thank you, Sonya, for being with us here today. And of course, the forum is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Alicia. Thank you to the UNAM. It's always a pleasure to come and talk through the UNAM. And I also want to say that this presentation is taken from a much longer study that was that I performed with a research fellowship at the Université de Guadalajara, the Center for Advanced Studies in Latin America. So I want to start by asking a question and pointing out a contradiction, which is that Latin America is actually one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a woman. The levels of violence there are worse than places at war. And yet, when we think about Latin America, we think about the values and the culture of Latin America, we think of this intense love for mothers and great respect for women. So there's this contradiction about that. And what I'm going to try to tell you is that this contradiction and this gender violence really comes from historical patterns that begin with the conquests by the Spanish and later the Portuguese of Latin America. First, some numbers, just to talk to you a little bit about the violence. According to the United Nations, the most dangerous places in Latin America and in the world to be a woman are El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. They have the highest rates of gender violence in the world. Now, within these numbers, in many of these places, there's incredible violence. And this violence affects both men and women. The actual rate of men being killed is higher, but the rate of women being killed is growing much faster than the rate of men being attacked or killed. And here's some more numbers. Between 2010, more than 5,000 women and girls were brutally murdered in Guatemala. In 2004, an average of 4 girls and or women were murdered every day in Mexico. And the numbers going on and on. But just looking at numbers without parsing them, without analyzing them, doesn't take us very far. If we look at those numbers, the women that are most in danger are the women who are marginalized because of their poverty, their lack of education, and to a certain extent, their age. The youngest women are the most at risk. Another aspect of vulnerability is that very often they are racialized. And it's these things that I want to talk about in terms of the way the tradition of conquest and colonialism has exoticized, sexualized, and created a sense of possessing the bodies of particularly of racialized women. Paulina Garcia del Moral writes of women who are products of colonialism as, and here I'm quoting, the racialized femininity that becomes a marker of disposability. All right, so where does this come from? So what I'm trying to argue in the longer study and here tonight is that it comes from the conquest. Karen Vieira Powers writes that the conquest was the crucible for gender relations, and it was not a neutral process. From the very beginning of contact and conquest, these gender relations were very much marked by certain patterns. First, we see a very hegemonic masculinity from the soldiers of conquest, which is not surprising. We see that in his letters to the king, Hernán Cortés presented himself as this very hegemonic man, very conquering, very, and that the indigenous populations were so feminine that they subjugated themselves, that they agreed to be possessed, they agreed to be colonized. These are mythologies, but this is how it was presented. So Cortés, along with other conquerors in both in Mexico or New Spain and other regions of Latin America, were establishing a new patriarchy in which the masculinity of the conquerors depended on the feminization of indigenous men. We also see, so indigenous men were feminized and were relegated to marginal roles in society. But they were not the only ones to be affected by the conquest and colonialism. Of course, indigenous women in this period experienced rape on an unprecedented scale. In fact, rape was very often used as a kind of strategy of domination. Archaeologist Suzanne Spencer Woods argues that the rape of indigenous women was an institution of conquest. It was linked also to the feminization, the continued feminization of indigenous men, who, when they tried to protect their wives, their daughters, their mothers, were often maimed or killed by Spanish soldiers. One Franciscan friar wrote in 1598 that when the Spanish soldiers made war on the Pueblo Indians, they shouted, here I quote, "Let us go to the Pueblos to fornicate with Indian women. Only with lascivious treatment are Indian women conquered," end of quote. So the sexual assault of indigenous women valorized Spanish men and their masculinity, and it also rendered indigenous men incapable of defending their wives, mothers, daughters, etc., and thus feminizing them. The bodies of indigenous women and later African women became part of the spoils of conquest. And this is really important because women's bodies become something that are controlled and possessed through the conquest. Their bodies are turned into objects and controllable body, disposable. Within the colony, of course, I would just love to talk to you about this a whole lot more. It's my specialty, but I'll try to go over it quickly. So within the colony, indigenous women were, and African or Afro-descendant women were very often became the objects of erotic desire. And so this connection between racialization and being available and then this gender violence is really important. All right, so I'll continue. Now, some of the things that are really important to understand is through this period, through the colonial period, there are two things I think that become really important. I'll talk about a bit more. Is one, that gender violence becomes normalized. That is not something that seems extraordinary. And two, it becomes invisible to a certain extent. And so the documentary record is usually about violence that goes too far. Now, one of the concepts that the Spanish brought and was part of both social attitudes and legal doctrines was that men had the right to exert just discipline. Moralists like Juan de la Cerda, who wrote a lot and was very influential, invoked the wedding vows to state the women must obey and fear their spouses in the same way as they feared and obeyed God. When husbands perceived disobedience, social values and legal doctrine allowed them to moderately punish their wives. If they went too far, it was called sevicia, or a kind of cruelty. But as expected, it was normal that husbands would do this. Now, one of the things that's sort of interesting, and there's these patterns that develop in this period and that continue in the 19th and 20th century, is that men, is particularly lower